The gavel cracked down like thunder. In the silent chamber, the echo rolled across the polished wooden benches and up to the vaulted ceiling where brass lamps hummed faintly. A courtroom is meant to hold order, but at that instant it felt more like a battlefield, hearts on one side, lies on the other. John Miller, 32, leaned forward at the plaintiff's table, his hands slamming against the wood. His voice broke, half rage, half heartbreak. She didn't just weave me. She stole Max. My dog is my family. Across the aisle, Sarah Collins, 29, didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed as if she were in a cafe, not under oath. Her lips curled into a smile too sharp to be casual. Quote, Max chose me. You never deserved him. The spectators stirred. A woman in the second row gasped. Somewhere in the back, a court clerk's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. The judge, a gray-haired figure in a black robe, lifted an eyebrow but said nothing yet. The authority of the court didn't silence the bitterness. If anything, it magnified it. The brass nameplate in front of the bench, "In Justice We Trust," caught the fluorescent light and gleamed coldly, as if the engraving itself knew this case was less about property and more about betrayal. John's fingers trembled against the tabletop. He wasn't a man who usually lost control. His colleagues knew him as composed, measured, but now his jaw clenched so hard it seemed pain shot through his temples. His breathing was uneven, ragged. The image of Max brown fur, bright eyes, the wagging tail that used to greet him every evening after work, burned in his mind like a photograph he couldn't tear up. Sarah tilted her chin higher, as though every second she spoke made her stronger. To her, this was not about companionship or justice. It was about control, about winning the breakup by any means. John's lawyer, a sharp-suited woman named Rebecca Hayes, placed a steadying hand on his arm, whispering, "Let me handle this." But John pulled slightly away, unwilling to sit silent while his bond with Max was mocked as if it were a disposable toy. "Order in the court," the judge finally said, voice deep, resonant, carrying a warning. His gavel tapped once more, this time softer, though the sound still sliced the air. But the damage was already done. The room had shifted. Everyone inside, law clerks, reporters scribbling in notepads, even the bailiff standing stone-faced by the door, felt it. This was not just another squabble over property. This was about love, loyalty, and betrayal, wrapped in the body of a golden retriever. John pressed his palms flat against the table, forcing steadiness back into his voice. "Your Honor, this isn't about possession. It's about care. About family." His throat tightened on the last word. Sarah let out a short laugh, sharp as glass. "Family? He's a dog, John. You treated him like a trophy. You think buying him kibble makes you a father?" The words landed heavy. John flinched, but his eyes did not break from hers. His silence carried more weight than any protest could. The judge exhaled, his fingers drumming on the bench, measuring the temperature of the room. "This case," he said slowly, "will be tried like any other. With facts, with evidence, not with shouting." The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenograph machine, preserving every barb, every tremor, every pause that stretched too long. Rebecca Hayes leaned toward John again, whispering, "Stay calm. Every word matters. Don't let her bait you." But Sarah was already baiting, her smirk widening as though she thrived on the spectacle. "You'll see," she said under her breath, though loud enough for the first two rows to hear. "Max was mine long before you noticed." John's pulse thundered in his ears. He thought of the first night he brought Max home, a trembling puppy curled up on his chest. He thought of the mornings spent jogging together by the lake, of the way the dog nudged his hand on nights when loneliness hit the hardest. And now Sarah was painting that love as fiction. The gavel struck again, 3 times, sharper, final. The room fell silent. The camera of imagination zoomed in, John's clenched fists whitening, Sarah's cool smile refusing to crack, the judge's stern eyes narrowing, the brass words on the bench gleaming like a warning. Then, as if the scene itself couldn't contain the tension, everything cut to black. On the empty screen, white letters blazed into existence. "She stole his dog after the breakup." And beneath, in smaller font, a whisper like a promise. "Actions have consequences." The witness stand creaked slightly as Sarah Collins settled herself into the chair. Her blazer was pressed, her hair pinned neatly back. To the casual eye, she could have passed for a professional, even a caretaker. Her attorney, Martin Grant, adjusted his tie and stepped forward with the air of a man who already believed victory belonged to him. "Ms. Collins," he began, his tone oiled with sympathy, "please tell the court in your own words how Max came to be in your care." Sarah drew a measured breath, her eyes glistening as though she'd summoned tears on cue. Max was neglected. John left him alone for hours, sometimes days. He would come home smelling of alcohol, stumbling, barely remembering to feed him. I was the one who filled his bowl. I was the one who took him to the vet. I saved Max. Without me, he would have starved. Her words floated heavy in the room, calculated to tug at the heart of every pet owner in the jury box. From the back row, a woman dabbed at her eye. A man shook his head in disapproval, glaring at John. The narrative was working. Martin paced slowly, each step deliberate. And did Mr. Miller ever contribute to Max's care in a meaningful way? Sarah tilted her head, the faintest smile curling at the corner of her mouth. Meaningful? No. He bought things, sure. Toys, a bed, sometimes food when he remembered. But love isn't in receipts. It's in time, patience, devotion. I protected Max. That's the truth. The phrase struck again. I protected Max. She said it once more when describing late-night walks, when John was passed out. She said it again when recounting an alleged fever Max had one winter. I protected Max, over and over, until the words became a rhythm, a drumbeat of virtue. Each repetition made John appear smaller, weaker, the kind of man unfit to hold on to even a dog's loyalty. John's attorney, Rebecca Hayes, clenched her pen tight, her knuckles whitening. She whispered to John, "Don't react. Every lie will unravel later." But John's silence betrayed the storm inside him. His jaw worked, his eyes bloodshot, his chest rising and falling too quickly. Martin Grant wasn't finished. "Miss Collins, can you tell the court what condition Max was in when you took him?" Sarah's voice dropped into the low register of practiced sorrow. Thin, listless, his ribs were visible. He wagged his tail, but weakly. "I wrapped him in a blanket that night. I promised him he would never feel abandoned again." A murmur rolled through the gallery. Heads nodded. Even the bailiff shifted slightly, as though uneasy. John gripped the table until his knuckles ached. He wanted to scream that Max was never thin, never starved, never abandoned. He wanted to hold up the photographs he carried in his phone, Max bounding across the park, muscles sleek, eyes bright. But Rebecca's hand pressed down on his arm. "Not yet," she whispered. Martin's voice sharpened. "And what about Mr. Miller's drinking? You mentioned it briefly." Sarah sighed, lowering her gaze as if ashamed on his behalf. "There were bottles everywhere. Sometimes I'd come home and find him asleep on the couch, empty cans on the floor. Max would be whining at the door, desperate to be walked. I couldn't stand it. That's when I knew if I didn't act, Max would suffer." The phrase returned like a hammer blow. I protected Max. By now, the jury's pens scratched across notepads. Every repetition was another nail sealing John's coffin. But then, almost imperceptible, something slipped. As Martin handed Sarah a stack of documents to confirm her version of events, one page caught the light. A veterinary invoice, stamped and signed, dated 3 months earlier. Sarah's fingers slid over it quickly, barely acknowledging it. "Yes, I took him to the vet that month too," she said. But Rebecca's eyes caught the detail. The invoice bore John Miller's name in bold, the credit card receipt stapled to the corner. It was subtle, easy to overlook in the flood of papers. The jurors didn't notice, the judge didn't pause. But Rebecca wrote one word in the margin of her legal pad: seed. Martin drew Sarah back to safer ground, guiding her testimony like a conductor. He called a neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, who echoed Sarah's story. "Yes, I saw John come home late. Sarah was the one walking Max." The neighbor's voice quavered as though truth lay in her tremor. Another so-called witness, a co-worker of Sarah's, claimed she often left early to rescue Max from being alone. Their testimonies braided together into a rope of half-truths and fabrications. John sat rigid, silent, each statement stacked like a brick in the wall, boxing him in. To the gallery, he looked cornered, powerless, guilty. Sarah leaned forward on the stand, her eyes finding his across the room. The smirk was gone, replaced by something colder. Triumph. She mouthed the words without sound. "I protected Max." John lowered his gaze, but the fury in his chest flared hotter than ever. He saw the jury leaning toward Sarah's story, saw the judge's brow furrow with concern. He was being written into the role of villain in his own life, and yet beneath the weight of her lies, beneath the nodding heads, there lay that single invoice, that ignored receipt, that slip she could not erase. A seed, tiny but alive, waiting for the right soil to sprout. Rebecca closed her notepad softly, whispering, "They're buying her act." But lies don't age well in court. We'll crack it open. The rhythm of the testimony slowed, but Sarah struck one final blow before leaving the stand. She looked directly at the jury box and declared, "If anyone deserves Max, it's the one who protected him, and that was me." The words hung in the air like a curtain, thick and suffocating. The judge nodded gravely, allowing Sarah to step down. Martin Grant wore the grin of a man who thought the game already won. John's eyes remained fixed on the table, his reflection faintly visible on the polished wood. He was being buried under her story, but somewhere, deep inside, he knew the truth was patient. The truth was stubborn, and the truth had receipts. The courtroom had tilted against him. Sarah's story still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, stinging eyes and clouding judgment. The jurors' pens lay still now, their notes heavy with her repeated refrain, "I protected Max." For a moment, John Miller seemed swallowed whole by silence. His head bowed, his fingers pressed against the table as if to hold himself upright. Every beat of his heart echoed like a drum in his ears. Then, slowly, deliberately, he rose. No trembling hands, no sudden outbursts. Just the straightening of a back, the smoothing of a tie, the composure of a man stepping onto solid ground. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm, steady, carrying across the chamber without strain. "Under California Civil Code Section 655, companion animals are technically property. But in practice," he paused, letting the words hang, "they are more than that. Courts have begun treating them as family." The shift was immediate. Heads lifted. The gallery, once whispering judgments, now leaned forward. Even the court reporter glanced up briefly before resuming her furious typing. John slid a folder across the table. Rebecca Hayes rose beside him, presenting it to the clerk, who carried it to the bench. Inside, Max's registration papers, stamped with John Miller's name, vaccination records in the same name, a neat stack of veterinary receipts, each with his signature and credit card number. He continued, his tone measured, each phrase sharp as glass. "Every visit, every bill, every official document places Max in my care. I did not abandon him. I did not starve him. I raised him, provided for him, and loved him. The facts are written, not in sentiment, but in records." Sarah stiffened in her chair. For the first time since the trial began, her confident posture faltered. John didn't look at her. His eyes stayed locked on the judge. "I am not asking this court to take my word over hers. I am asking for preservation of evidence. The security camera outside my home, which recorded the night Max was taken, the credit card records for every vet visit, every bag of food. The truth does not need embellishment. It only needs to be preserved." The words carried a different weight than Sarah's pleas. Where hers had been heavy with drama, his were bare, clipped, and undeniable. The atmosphere shifted palpably. A juror in the back row, who had earlier scribbled neglect in bold letters, now circled it, frowning. A clerk near the door nodded faintly, as though something had clicked into place. Rebecca spoke softly beside him, almost inaudible. "Perfect. Keep going." John drew a steady breath. His eyes no longer glistened with tears. Instead, they sharpened, clear and unflinching. "I understand why emotions run high in cases like this. A dog is not furniture. He is a life. But emotion cannot erase ownership, nor can it rewrite facts." He tapped the folder gently, a quiet percussion to his words. "Max is mine, not because I say so, but because the law says so." Sarah shifted, her arms tightening across her chest. She leaned toward Martin Grant, whispering furiously. He scribbled a note, but kept his composure. The jury caught her agitation. The cracks were visible now. John continued, his voice steady, almost judicial in its cadence. "If this court wishes, we can call the veterinarian who treated Max. We can subpoena the clinic records. We can review surveillance footage. I welcome it, because unlike Ms. Collins, I have nothing to hide." The judge adjusted his glasses, studying the paperwork now spread before him. The gleam of the brass nameplate, "In Justice We Trust," reflected across his robe. For a moment, the only sound was the shuffle of papers and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Then John spoke again, this time slower, deeper, with a note of finality. "I am not here to perform. I am here to uphold the truth. And I ask this court to protect not only my rights, but the integrity of justice itself." The words struck with a resonance that Sarah's repetition could not match. They were not the pleas of a desperate man. They were the statements of someone rooted in law, in principle, in certainty. And then, the closing line delivered with the calm precision of a scalpel, "I know the law, Your Honor, because the law is what I serve." A hush fell over the room. The jurors exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably as though realizing how quickly they had believed Sarah's story. The gallery was still. Even the bailiff, who had kept his eyes fixed on a neutral point all morning, allowed himself a slight glance at John, a glance that carried respect. Rebecca leaned back, her smile faint but victorious. She knew the tide had turned. Sarah's face burned red, her confidence eroded. Her mantra, "I protected Max," sounded suddenly hollow, flimsy, like glass about to shatter. The judge tapped his pen against the bench. "This court will review the submitted records and consider the request for preservation of evidence." His tone carried a new weight, one that had not been there during Sarah's testimony. A tone of seriousness, of possibility. And in that moment, for the first time, John was no longer the man on trial. He was the man standing in the light of truth, calm and unshaken. The chamber exhaled collectively. The story was no longer Sarah's to control. Sarah Collins had leaned forward throughout John's testimony, her face twisted into a smirk. She could feel the jury's hesitation growing, and she wanted to strike before his calm words rooted too deep. Her attorney, Martin Grant, seized the moment. He rose abruptly, shaking his head as though weary of a charade. "Your Honor, I have to object." "What law?" "He's not an attorney. He's not an officer of the court. He's just a bitter ex-boyfriend reciting things he found on the internet." The words cut through the chamber like a blade. Several jurors nodded, reassured by the idea. A ripple of laughter broke from one corner of the gallery. Sarah allowed herself a full, triumphant grin. John did not flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down to the leather case at his side. His movements were unhurried, ceremonial even, as though he knew every eye was fixed on him. The latch snapped open. The sound, though soft, seemed to echo across the wood-paneled walls. From inside, John withdrew a small, hard-backed wallet, dark blue with gold trim. He held it for a moment in the low courtroom light, then turned it outward. The overhead lamps caught the metal crest embossed at the center. Letters glinted clear and unmistakable. United States, Federal Judge, appointed 2021. Gasps filled the courtroom. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor. A juror's jaw dropped open, her notepad sliding from her lap. The gallery erupted in whispers that rose into a roar. Sarah's smirk froze, her lips parting soundlessly. Her eyes darted to Martin Grant, but he looked just as stunned, his mouth tightening as color drained from his face. The presiding judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His expression shifted from skepticism to recognition. He gave a single, solemn nod, then rapped his gavel once. "Order," he commanded, though his voice carried an uncharacteristic weight of respect. "The court will recess briefly while we confirm the credentials presented." Clerks moved quickly, carrying the document toward the bench. The seal shimmered under the lights, authentic and irrefutable. The murmurs only grew louder, every reporter in the room scribbling frantically, every spectator straining to see. For Sarah, the walls seemed to close in. Just minutes earlier, she had painted him as irresponsible, negligent, unworthy. And yet here stood John Miller. Not just her ex-boyfriend, not just a man fighting for a dog, but a federal judge with authority that dwarfed everything she had tried to weaponize. When the presiding judge returned, his voice rang with finality, credentials verified. "This court acknowledges the Honorable Judge John Miller." The silence that followed was deafening. John slipped the badge back into his case with the same calm precision, then looked across the courtroom, straight at Sarah. His gaze no longer trembled with grief or anger. It was steady, judicial, a mirror reflecting her lies back upon her. Sarah's chair creaked as she shifted, her bravado stripped away. For the first time, she seemed small, fragile, cornered. The reversal was complete. The man she had painted as reckless and weak was, in truth, the embodiment of the very justice she had tried to manipulate. Martin Grant cleared his throat, fumbling for words. "Your Honor, this revelation, surely it—" The presiding judge cut him off, firm. "It changes nothing about the facts at hand, but it certainly changes the credibility of the parties." His eyes landed briefly on Sarah before returning to the bench. A heavy pause filled the chamber. It was more than silence. It was the sound of a narrative collapsing. John remained standing. He did not raise his voice nor gloat. He spoke simply, his words carrying the gravity of someone who no longer needed to prove himself. "I came here not as a judge, but as a man seeking fairness. I revealed my role only because my integrity was challenged. The truth, however, has a way of surfacing, whether we invite it or not." Sarah lowered her gaze, her hands twisting together in her lap. The confidence that once fueled her mantra, "I protected Max," was gone. What protection could she claim now, when the very institution of law stood embodied in the man she tried to destroy? The gallery felt the shift as well. Where once Sarah's voice had drawn sympathy, now it was John's composure that commanded reverence. Every whispered comment carried a new weight. "He's a judge, a federal judge. She lied to a judge." The presiding judge tapped his gavel once more. "This court will resume. But let there be no mistake, credibility has consequences." And with that, the tide turned entirely. The ex-boyfriend she tried to discredit had become the highest authority in the room. The power she thought she wielded dissolved in an instant, leaving her exposed, cornered, and silent. The courtroom was silent when the presiding judge cleared his throat. "The court will now admit video evidence, as requested." His gavel struck once, granting John Miller what he had asked for from the very beginning, the preservation, and now the presentation, of truth. A screen descended from the ceiling with a faint whir. The gallery leaned forward, breaths caught. Sarah Collins pressed herself deeper into her chair, her arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. The lights dimmed. The first video flickered to life, grainy footage from a security camera fixed on John's front yard. The timestamp glowed in the corner, 2:43 a.m., a summer night just 3 months ago. On screen, Sarah appeared. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder, then kneeling by the side gate. The metal glinted as she forced a latch open. A faint squeal from the speakers betrayed the lock giving way. The camera zoomed in. John had requested it frame by frame. There was no mistaking her face, her hair pulled back, her hand tugging on the kennel door. Inside, Max stirred, tail thumping nervously. Sarah slipped a leash around his neck and yanked him into the night. The footage froze. The room erupted in murmurs, gasps, whispers. Sarah's attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection. This doesn't prove ownership, only that." The presiding judge raised a hand. "Overruled." The footage clearly demonstrates unauthorized removal. Continue. John didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Sarah. He simply said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "Wait, that was the night Max vanished. She didn't rescue him. She stole him." The lights dimmed again. A new video began to play. This time, the image was sharper, audio clearer, body camera footage from a responding police officer. The angle shook slightly as the officer approached Sarah outside her apartment complex. She stood there with Max at her side, her voice rising in agitation. On the recording, her words cut through the speakers. Undeniable. Key. He'll never see Max again. Not as long as I breathe. The sound was chilling in its certainty, in the malice dripping from each syllable. The courtroom reacted instantly. One juror covered her mouth. A man in the gallery muttered, "My God." The bailiff shifted his stance, his jaw tightening. Sarah's face drained of color. Her lips parted, searching for explanation, but none came. The video ended. Silence fell once more. John turned to the bench, his voice low but resolute. She didn't protect Max. She weaponized him. Against me. Against the truth. Then came the documents. Rebecca Hayes approached with a binder so thick it landed on the evidence table with a thud. She flipped it open to a series of receipts, invoices, and statements. Every veterinary bill, every vaccination, every emergency visit, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. All paid by John Miller, not one by Ms. Collins. The judge leafed through the stack, nodding gravely. The jurors craned their necks, scanning the bolded name, John Miller, printed on every page. Rebecca pointed to a particularly large bill from just 6 months prior. Mr. Miller paid for Max's surgery out of pocket, $5,000. If he were negligent, if he didn't care, why would he do this? The rhetorical question echoed. No answer came. Sarah shifted in her seat, her hands trembling now. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. No words escaped. The lie that had carried her through the first half of the trial had crumbled, brick by brick. John took one step forward. He wasn't shouting. His voice was steady, deliberate, every syllable landing like a hammer. You lied under oath. You lied under oath. Not just about me, about Max. The weight of the accusation filled the chamber. GHO! Even the court reporter slowed, glancing up with wide eyes before returning to her keys. Rebecca wasn't finished. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd also like to introduce comparative photos. The judge nodded. The screen lit up again, side-by-side images of Max. On the left, Max in John's care, bright eyes, shiny coat, tail wagging in a blur. On the right, taken during a police encounter, Max's fur duller, his posture slumped, his ribs faintly visible under poor light. Gasps rippled once more. The images told a story words never could. Rebecca drove the point home. This is not protection. This is not protection. This is possession by force. And it is neglect. Sarah covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking, not with tears of remorse, but with the crushing weight of exposure. The presiding judge spoke slowly, his voice deliberate. The evidence stands. It will be entered into the record. John didn't move, but his eyes fixed on Sarah, not with vengeance, but with clarity. The strength of truth no longer needed anger to bolster it. He said only one thing, quiet enough that it demanded silence to be heard. Tasked, Max deserved better than to be used as a weapon. He deserved love, not lies, and the room knew. It wasn't just Sarah who had been judged that day. It was the lies themselves, stripped bare by the cold, unflinching light of evidence. The courtroom was still reverberating with the sting of Sarah's lies being torn apart when John Miller straightened once more. His voice was calm, but it carried the authority of someone who knew this fight was larger than 2 people and a single dog. Your Honor, he began, this trial may seem like a private dispute between former partners. But what we've seen here today is not isolated. It is part of a pattern, one that repeats itself in courts across this country. The jurors leaned forward. The gallery, filled with reporters and onlookers, hushed. John motioned toward the screen. Rebecca clicked a remote, and new words appeared, bold and stark against the dark background. 68% of divorce cases involved disputes over companion animals. Another line followed. 41% of those cases reveal one party using the pet as a tool of revenge or control. The numbers hung heavy in the air. They weren't just statistics, they were a mirror reflecting the stories of countless families. John's tone deepened. This isn't just neglect. This is coercive control. This is a design. When love ends, too often cruelty begins. And the ones who suffer most are the voiceless. Our animals treated as pawns in a war they never chose. A murmur spread through the gallery. One juror scribbled furiously, underlining the figures twice. A woman in the back row nodded, lips pressed tight, as though she had lived through the same cruelty. John pressed on. Across the United States, the law has been slow to adapt. Traditionally, pets were considered mere property like a couch or a car. But pets are not property. They are family, they feel loyalty, pain, and fear. They are used against us not because of their market value, but because of their emotional value. The presiding judge's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The brass nameplate before him, "In Justice We Trust," seemed to gleam brighter under the lights. John gestured to the screen again. Another line appeared, sharp and undeniable. In the past decade, 22 states have proposed or passed legislation considering the best interest of pets in divorce. He let the words sink in before adding, "This court is not alone. Legislatures are recognizing what society already knows. Pets are more than property. They are part of our families. And when they are used as weapons, the harm extends beyond broken hearts. It erodes trust in justice itself." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the jurors. The strength she had once wielded through tears and theatrics was gone. The tide had left her stranded, her story now a cautionary tale in a much larger narrative. John's voice carried the weight of lived truth, not just personal pain. "I want this court to see beyond me, beyond Sarah, beyond Max. This is about the precedent we set. Do we allow lies and manipulation to decide the fate of our animals? Or do we acknowledge what they are, sentient beings who depend on us, who trust us, who deserve justice as much as we do?" He paused, scanning the faces in the jury box. The silence was thick, the kind that only comes when hearts and minds are being forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Rebecca advanced the next slide. Simple text filled the screen. "This is not a personal flaw. This is a design." The words pulsed like a verdict in themselves. John repeated them, his voice ringing. "This is not a personal flaw. This is a design. And if we don't confront it, it will continue, case after case, lie after lie, dog after dog, ripped from the person who truly loved them." A reporter's pen scratched frantically in the gallery. The clerk, barely 25, swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on John as though she were seeing her own future reflected in his words. John concluded, his voice steady. "This court has the chance not just to resolve a dispute, but to speak to a nation. To say that coercive control has no place in our homes, our relationships, or our laws. To say that justice protects the voiceless too." He let the final sentence hang in the still air. For the first time, the courtroom felt larger than itself. It was no longer just about John and Sarah. It was about the system, the statistics, the laws slowly shifting toward compassion. It was about every Max, every dog or cat caught in the crossfire of human spite. The judge leaned back, hands steepled, his face grave. The weight of John's words had reached him, and through him, the institution he represented. And somewhere in that silence, the truth took root, not only about who owned Max, but about the kind of justice society was willing to accept. The chamber was silent as the presiding judge adjusted his glasses and shuffled the papers before him. The weight of hours of testimony, evidence, and revelation hung heavy in the room. Every person present seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the final strike of justice. Having reviewed the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice deep and deliberate. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Inve, John Miller." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Reporters scrambled to jot notes, cameras clicked. Sarah Collins froze, her body rigid, her eyes locked on the bench, as though refusing to believe the words forming in the air. The judge continued. "Custody of the dog Max is hereby returned to Mr. Miller, the rightful owner. Furthermore, Ms. Collins is found guilty of perjury, lying under oath, and trespass for unlawful removal of property from Mr. Sest, Miller's residence." The words landed like a gavel blow themselves. Sarah's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her attorney sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. John exhaled slowly. For weeks he had lived under a cloud of suspicion and slander, watching his bond with Max turned into a weapon against him. Now the storm had broken, and the light of truth cut through. The judge wasn't finished. "Ms. Collins will face financial penalties for her actions, including restitution for damages, court costs, and a fine for perjury. Sentencing will proceed at a later date. This ruling is final." The gavel struck 3 times, the sound sharp, echoing, undeniable. John rose from his seat. He didn't smile, he didn't celebrate. Instead, he turned, his eyes locking on Sarah. She looked smaller now, her arms folded across herself, no longer in defiance but in defense. Her once defiant smirk was gone, replaced by a pale, trembling mask. He spoke clearly, each word carrying across the chamber with the weight of a verdict all its own. "You thought stealing love would make you win, but actions have consequences." The words seemed to slice the air. A juror leaned back, nodding almost imperceptibly. A reporter underlined the sentence 3 times in her notes. John took 1 step forward, his voice gaining force, rhythm, and resonance. The repetition was deliberate, hammering each nail into the coffin of deceit. "You lied about care. You lied about love. You lied about loyalty. And today," the truth answered back. The cadence struck like drums in a march. With every line, Sarah shrank further into her chair. The gallery leaned in, caught in the swell of his words. For John, it wasn't triumph, it was release. The lies had bound him, suffocated him, painted him as something he was not. Now he stood free, his voice carrying not just for himself, but for every silent victim of manipulation and coercion. He paused, then delivered the line that would echo beyond the courtroom, destined for headlines and lecture halls alike. In this court, loyalty is not stolen. It is proven. The silence that followed was electric, thick with catharsis. Even the presiding judge allowed himself the faintest nod, as if acknowledging that justice had been served not only in law, but in spirit. Max barked faintly from the hallway where he had been kept during proceedings, the sound cutting through the silence like a seal on the verdict. The gallery chuckled softly, a release of tension, but in that bark was something deeper, affirmation. John finally allowed himself the smallest smile, not for victory, not for vindication, but for the knowledge that Max would be home again. The bailiff announced, "Court is adjourned." The room stirred to life, but the echoes of John's words remained, written not just in transcripts but in memory. Reporters rushed out to deliver their stories. Clerks exchanged glances, some with awe, some with newfound conviction. The phrase whispered again and again in the hallway as people left the courtroom. Loyalty is not stolen. It is proven. Sarah remained in her seat, unmoving, her eyes fixed downward. The lies that once shielded her had dissolved, leaving her exposed. She had tried to use love as a weapon. Instead, it became her undoing. John gathered his papers quietly, his composure unshaken. When he stepped toward the door, Rebecca at his side, he carried himself not like a victor, but like a man restored, his dignity, his truth, and his dog reclaimed. And as the wooden door swung open, letting in the harsh light of the corridor, one truth lingered behind, etched into the very walls of the courtroom. Justice had spoken. And it had spoken clearly. When the verdict echoed through the chamber, it didn't just end a courtroom battle. It rippled outward, through reputations, through institutions, through lives beyond those seated at the plaintiffs' and defendants' tables. For Sarah Collins, the fall was swift and brutal. Once she had walked into the courthouse with the poise of a victor in waiting, convinced her performance would win sympathy. Now she walked out with her head bowed, her name forever tainted by the record of perjury. Lying under oath was no longer a tactic, it was a stain. Employers, neighbors, even friends who had once admired her, resolved, now kept their distance. She had not only lost Max, she had lost credibility, trust, and the one thing she craved most, control. The court's ruling barred her from ever claiming ownership of Max again. More than that, it set a precedent that followed her like a shadow. She was the woman who tried to weaponize love and got caught. In legal databases, her name would sit beside the word perjury for the rest of her life. For John Miller, vindication came not with cheers, but with quiet dignity. He walked out of the courthouse with Max at his side, the golden retriever bounding toward him with the joyful innocence of a reunion long overdue. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, but John offered only measured words. "I didn't fight to win," he told the press, resting his hand gently on Max's head. "I fought to protect. Today isn't about me. It's about recognizing that loyalty can't be stolen. It can only be proven." The quote spread like wildfire. Legal blogs dissected it, animal rights groups tweeted it, and newspapers placed it in bold above their headlines. Overnight, John became more than a federal judge who had defended his own dog. He became a symbol of justice, proof that calm resolve and evidence could cut through even the most elaborate deception. The system itself shifted under the weight of the case. Law professors added it to syllabi under the growing section on custody disputes. Students debated its implications. Should pets be treated as property or as family? Should best interest of the animal replace simple ownership rights? John's case became a teaching tool, a live example of how evolving law could meet evolving society. But the impact wasn't confined to textbooks. In Texas, hundreds of miles away, a man named Daniel Perez read about John's victory in the newspaper. For 2 years, Daniel had mourned the loss of his bulldog, Bruno, taken by an ex-girlfriend during a bitter breakup. He had believed the law was stacked against him, that the fight wasn't worth waging. But seeing John's case gave him courage. With renewed determination, Daniel filed suit. Armed with receipts, veterinary records, and the precedent John had reinforced, he won. For the first time in years, Bruno came bounding back into his life. Daniel told reporters, his voice breaking, "That case gave me hope. It gave me my family back." Back in the courthouse where it all began, another story unfolded. Clara Nguyen, a young clerk who had sat quietly through every day of testimony, found herself transformed. She had watched the evidence, the rhetoric, the reveal of John's identity, and more importantly, she had felt the weight of the moment when statistics turned into something bigger than numbers. That night, Clara went home and opened her laptop. She researched law schools with animal law programs. The next morning, she submitted her first application essay, beginning with the words, "I once saw a dog named Max prove that loyalty is not stolen, it is protected." The case had not only shifted the law, It had lit sparks in lives that might one day reshape it again. The courthouse itself, too, bore the mark of change. Months later, a new brass plaque was mounted on the wall just outside courtroom 4B, the chamber where John had stood, calm and unwavering. Its inscription read simply, "The Hall of Fair Living." Visitors stopped to read it, to touch the cool metal, to remember the case that had turned a simple custody dispute into a statement of principle. For Sarah, the plaque was a reminder of her downfall. For John, it was a quiet vindication. For the public, it was a beacon, a reminder that justice doesn't just punish lies, it honors truth, loyalty, and care. The aftershocks of the trial continued to ripple outward, not through grand speeches or sweeping reforms, but through small, steady changes. A man reunited with his dog, a clerk choosing a new career, a plaque shining under courthouse lights. And for Mac's tail-wagging, eyes bright, it meant only this. He was home. The heavy courthouse doors swung open, spilling light into the night. Outside, cameras flashed in a frenzy. Microphones pushed forward like bayonets. Reporters shouted his name, their voices tumbling over one another. John Miller stepped out slowly, his shoulders squared, his black coat brushing against his knees. At his side, Max bounded happily, tail wagging furiously, tugging at the leash as if the crowd itself were a game. The sight softened the tension in the air. For a moment, the crowd of journalists and onlookers went quiet, watching the simple reunion between man and dog, between truth and loyalty. John raised a hand, not to silence, but to steady. His voice, when it came, was calm and unshakable, carrying over the hum of cameras and the chaos of the press. Props. Silence only feeds injustice. Lies kill faster than fists. Share this story so no one ever loses family, human, or animal to control again. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling. "Show!" Reporters scribbled furiously. A few nodded, their professional distance briefly broken by conviction. John knelt briefly, resting his hand on Max's head. The dog looked up at him with bright eyes, tail sweeping the ground like a metronome of joy. He straightened, looked into the sea of lenses, and delivered the final line with the weight of a verdict. Actions have consequences. Tonight, justice drove the final mile. The crowd erupted in questions, flashes, applause, but John said nothing more. He turned, Max trotting proudly at his side, and walked into the night not as a man seeking victory, but as a man who had proven that loyalty cannot be stolen. And in every notebook, every camera reel, every headline to follow, the message burned clear. Justice, once spoken, cannot be silenced.